Hi, everyone. I'm Nadina Galle, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Internet of Nature podcast. I'm so glad you're here. This week, I'm thrilled to introduce you to Lucy Almond. Lucy has been the driving force behind the Nature4Climate coalition, where she is currently the chair. Nature4Climate is a strategic mobilization response to climate change that aims to increase investment and action on nature based solutions, with 18 different coalition partners, and it's hosted by the Nature Conservancy. Lucy actually spent the first 18 years of her career at BP in a range of roles across the company's alternative energy, technology, upstream trading, and corporate communications divisions. So she's got an interesting perspective on using technology in a way that is restorative rather than exploitative of nature. Although much of what she did at BP was also related to renewable energy. So she's got a lot of interesting things to say about the differences working in this field versus at BP. I asked her all about that in our conversation. Before we kick off, a big thank you to this season's sponsor, the International Society of Arboriculture. The ISA is a global network that uses research, technology, and education to promote the professional practice of arboriculture and the benefits of trees. ISA exists so that professionals, allied professionals, public officials, and consumers worldwide recognize the economic, environmental, and societal benefits and values of trees and their care. We want to thank them for their support. And as always, remember to subscribe and leave us a comment or review if you learned something new. Enjoy this episode with Lucy. Hi, Lucy. Thanks for being here.
Hi, very, very pleased to talk
Thanks
to
for
you,
coming
Nadina.
on. Before we kick off, would you mind just briefly introducing yourself?
Sure. So I'm Lucy Almond. I'm based in the UK, and I'm the chair of the Nature4Climate Coalition. And I also work as the head of strategic communications for the World Economic Forum's nature-based solutions platform as well. So I wear two
Right. And
hats.
that's something that's received a ton of media attention in recent years. The whole kind of discourse around nature based solutions has really kind of, I would say, ramped up into the mainstream even. What's that been like the last couple of years working in this field?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really, really exciting. And so we started Nature4Climate about 4 years ago with just four of the large environmental organizations back at COP in Bonn, actually,
Mm.
in 2017. And we've now grown to this initiative of 18 large environmental organizations, some of the UN agencies, and some corporate coalition groups. And from the start, our mission was really around promoting the role of nature as a climate solution and to try to mobilize investment into those areas and to increase government action and basically accelerate the deployment of nature-based solutions between now and
Right.
2030, which is the next kind of 10 years being a critical period. So we've we've been working both on the communication side to try and raise awareness and advocate for nature-based solutions, but also more around how do you mobilize action from these areas such as governments and the private sector, and how to kind of create a movement really. So it's been really exciting to be at the
Yeah,
heart
I
of that.
bet. Because perhaps maybe even to backtrack for just a second, for some of the viewers or listeners that aren't aware of or perhaps are confused by what's meant by nature-based solutions, do you mind just defining that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a couple of different definitions out there, and we use the broadest possible nature-based solutions definition that the IUCN group have been
Mm.
promoting and trying to create standards around. And so that's where but nature can be used for a whole raft of environmental benefits, including climate, so such as flood protection or developing livelihoods. But they have to have a component which is a environmental and social benefit. So a nature-based solution can't just be using nature for one specific element, such as
Mm.
carbon capture. It has to have these broader environmental and social benefits, particularly for Nature4Climate. and it's in the name, we originally focused on what we called natural climate solutions, which was a kind of subset of this broader nature based solutions. And that was where nature can be used for both climate mitigation and adaptation purposes. And it's really things like how do you protect and restore ecosystems for carbon mitigation and adaptation. So things like avoided deforestation, reforestation, protection of coastal wetlands and mangroves, and then more sustainable agriculture practices, and all of which have a climate mitigation and adaptation
I'm
benefit.
so glad to hear you say that that part of the focus is also on maintaining what we already have, because I think that often gets lost in the discussion. We get so excited by all of the new possibilities that might be out there, whether it's, brand new kind of green roof designs or pocket parks or this kind of, nature-based wetland, which are all needed and all very exciting. But indeed, I think we lose some of the focus on just protecting and maintaining what we already have, because that in itself is already playing such an important role.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the critical message really that we want to take to the world. And when Nature for Climate first started, we were founded really by the Nature Conservancy on a particular science paper that looked at how different ecosystems can create a climate
Mm,
mitigation benefit. And the most important one is the
right.
avoided destruction of ecosystems. That is far and away the biggest and most cost effective way of delivering these
Mm.
nature based solutions is to avoid deforestation, to avoid destruction. And then there are other components too, which is around improving the management of your natural ecosystems and landscapes, which has a large potential. And then this restoration piece, which often looks at reforestation, for example. But actually, by far the biggest chunk and most valuable chunk is this area of avoided destruction of our intact
So
ecosystems.
just to dive into that a little bit more, how do you guys do that in an environment where there's rampant urban development, resource exploitation? It seems like endless growth. How are you guys balancing all of those different needs and demands on natural ecosystems, but still protecting them?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously the biggest challenge is around at the heart of the whole conservation movement is nature
Yeah.
versus development. And sometimes that's phrased as kind of nature versus
Mm.
economic development. And I think there's one statistic which is terrifying, which is that there's 40 times more finance going into the destruction of ecosystems than that's going into the
40,
protection
40
of
times more.
ecosystems. So at 40 times, yeah, 40 times more finance going into the destruction of forests, particularly, rather than the kind of
Wow.
protection of forests. And that's the situation we're currently living in. And there are many, many governments around the world, particularly in the global south and the tropics, that have a lot of these valuable ecosystems that are looking to also develop in the same way that development happened in the global north in the last couple of hundred years. And so getting those trade-offs right between the ability to create livelihoods, develop infrastructure, have jobs, and have sort of kind of export and trade is very important to get that balanced with the protection of these ecosystems. And many of our member organizations, our environmental uh, member organizations, that's exactly what they're working on. They're working with these governments and with companies to ensure the protection of valuable ecosystems, but at the same time, you know, within the realities of how the global
Mm.
economy works.
What is an example of a country or a region that you feel is doing a particularly good job at that?
So, I mean, I think Indonesia, for example, gets a lot of stick for deforestation. And actually, when you look at the last 10 years, the government policies around regulation to protect peatlands and to stop deforestation have actually created a situation where the deforestation statistics
Mm.
are improving. And so I think what they're struggling where there is they've got, hundreds of millions of people looking to have livelihoods and companies that are looking to do the right thing. And they've actually put in place the policy frameworks that help protect their ecosystems while at the same time balancing that with their development agenda. Um, and and even in places like Brazil, which currently there's a lot of talk about what's happening in Brazil. There are states within Brazil that are tackling with exactly those kind of trade-offs of how do you develop and at the same time how do you protect
Hmm.
the
I
ecosystems.
feel like a country that gets a lot of media attention in terms of, the beacon of light that might be doing it the right way is Costa Rica. Is that does that fit into this? Has what has Costa Rica done that seems to be so difficult to do in other places?
Yeah, I mean, Costa Rica is the shining example of how to do this well, where they had a lot of deforestation in the 70s, which they've managed to turn around. And partly, I think they did what we have been asking governments to do is to take nature considerations into the heart of every
Mm.
decision they make so that you have every single government decision or policy decision or corporate decision gets made with a nature consideration at its heart. And obviously, one of the things they did was develop a sort of payments for ecosystem services, and sort of integrated these nature considerations into their own legal frameworks, and therefore are a shining example to hold up, I think, to the rest of the world. It's very hard to do that everywhere else, but it can be done. And they have turned the corner
Yeah,
really
it
on
seems
these
that way.
things.
Absolutely. So of course, I think Nature4Climate focuses on really a lot of large scale ecosystem restoration, right? Large swaths of trying to combat deforestation. It's that I think seems far away from where the majority of us live, which is in cities. What is Nature4Climate doing at this intersection of nature, cities, climate change, and ultimately growth? Because of course, urbanization can also be one of the leading causes of a lot of this ecosystem destruction.
Yeah, I mean, I think our role really as Nature for Climate has been one of
Mm.
awareness raising of the role that nature can play as a climate solution, but not just as a climate solution. It's integral role in food systems production as well. And so I think our interaction with cities, we don't, I mean, as Nature for Climate, we don't work closely in the kind of urban environment. Our member organizations tend to focus on sort of conservation projects and corporate engagement, in particularly in these regions that are slightly more vulnerable. But I do think we have an important role to play to educate consumers in cities around the impact that they have on nature. So the imported impact, for example, on the kinds of food you eat, the fashion you buy, any product you buy has an impact somewhere
Yeah,
in the world on nature and climate. And so being able to tell that story to consumers in an accessible way, I think is something actually we all need to do, not just the conservation organizations, but governments and the companies that actually sell this product have a responsibility to educate consumers about the impact on the environment of the different kinds of products we all buy as part of our daily, use.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's interesting because it's not just about, the direct impact that you might feel whether or not you have green space at your front door if you live in a city, but also just the embodied impacts of being an urban citizen and what does that look like in the larger global supply chain, right? Which again quickly leads you to a lot of why we have, this resource exploitation happening at such large scales. I wanted to ask you,
Yeah,
Lucy. I
yeah.
mean, wanted to have you on the show for multiple different reasons, but one of the most exciting ones I thought was this kind of new launch that you've been working on called NatureTech, the NatureTech movement. What is that, and why is it important?
Yeah, I mean, this is something we've been working on just for a year or so. So since we've been involved in the kind of technology that surrounds nature-based solutions, I've heard multiple different kind of definitions of what nature tech is or what it could be. For Nature4Climate, nature tech was, we were quite specific in that we felt that nature tech was something that could enable and accelerate the deployment of
Mm.
nature based solutions. So that would be technology basically and innovation. So not just pure technology, but innovative business models, for example, that sit at this nexus of climate and nature. And I think when most people hear about technology and climate change, they sort of think of these somewhat daunting concepts of geoengineering or advanced carbon capture and storage technologies. But we can see already that there are a wealth of ways in which these the latest technology advances, such as artificial intelligence or geospatial mapping or drones or blockchain, that all of these can be deployed in the service
Mm.
of nature and the service of nature and climate. And so we felt that there was a gap in terms of trying to identify this as an emerging sector, create a narrative around that sector, make some connections between these types of companies and investors, these types of companies and their customer base. And the primary reason really is one about trust. So given that nature-based solutions is now, as you mentioned, going mainstream, there's been a lot of enhanced scrutiny on the role that nature-based solutions can play, and rightly, a lot of skepticism about whether, nature-based solutions can be permanent, whether they can bring benefits to communities. And we felt that one possible way to help build that trust would be the deployment of technology
Mm.
in the right way and in the right place can help create transparency, accountability, monitoring, measuring, all the things that people have been saying, well, we're not sure that you can do monitoring and measuring for nature based solutions. But actually, the use of these advanced technologies mean you can actually monitor above ground biomass in real time. 10 years ago, that would have been absolutely crazy to say you could do that. But a combination of these satellite imaging technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, it means that there are companies and organizations out there now that are doing exactly that.
What has been the response so far? Because I completely follow your thinking in terms of that technology can help to actually build trust. But I think so many of people, practitioners working on the ground, see technology as something not to be trusted, and definitely not something to be adopted in their daily work. So
Yeah.
what's been the response to that from practitioners on the ground?
Yeah, I think it's a very mixed response at the moment, and as I say, it's an
Mm.
emerging sector. But I think there are a couple of different responses. So you have the challenges and concerns are really around technology that could be used to further create an imbalance in power. So there's already a huge power imbalance between these large companies and governments, and often the communities on the front line, such as smallholder farmers or
Mm.
indigenous communities. And I think a genuine concern that technology be used to further sort of alienate these groups and to keep them out of the decision making. So I think that's on the one hand. The other is the opposite of that, that actually technology can help empower these communities and democratize
Mm.
decision making. Um, so, for example, there's a community in the Ecuadorian Amazon that have been using smartphone technology to help map their territory and therefore use that technology to then help make the case for their land rights in that area. And there have been lots of other examples of where this technology can be deployed to support the local communities on the ground. But obviously, you have to be careful about how this is done. And what you don't want is just big companies going in dictating technology use for their own good without actually involving the communities right from the start to see
Right.
what their needs
Yeah,
are.
and that's why it's interesting to, as you rightfully said in your example from Ecuador, that I assume, at least it sounds like that came from the community. That was an initiative that had a real need, a problem to be able to map their land correctly, and they were simply looking at for the tools that they perhaps already had at their disposal to be able to do that in a much more cost-effective and I assume less tedious way.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's just one example about, and that was about land rights. There have been other examples, I think quite a well documented one in the Peruvian Amazon, where indigenous peoples use smartphones and satellite data, and they were able to actually drastically reduce illegal
Wow.
deforestation by using a combination of those technologies to help, basically to help monitor and report instances of where there were illegal uh, incursions basically within their territory. So there's a huge
That's
amount of
incredible.
potential with this type of technology, I think, to
No,
do
that's
things.
incredible. You hear similar stories, surrounding using even satellite imagery. Again, like you just said, Lucy, some of these applications were unheard of even 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. Um, about using satellite imagery to actually
Yeah.
be able to spot elephants. So just, for the people listening, this idea that you're using this satellite, which is orbiting around our Earth, kilometers and kilometers away from our surface, that are able to pinpoint where elephants have been in the last couple of days, because we're at the point now where we're not only getting that high resolution, but that kind of temporal resolution, so a frequency of images coming that more often, to be able to track something like elephant poaching. It's insane. Of course, you can use that technology for one of two ways. You can either use that technology to track where elephants are and therefore target your poaching efforts, or of course you can use them for the protection of elephants. So I think that kind of speaks to the massive responsibility that we have in how we use this technology. So how is that something that you balance within the nature tech movement?
Yeah, I think as with any emerging sector, you will get good actors and bad actors. And obviously, what we're doing within Nature for Climate is currently working with those companies that are doing things, clearly doing things in
Right.
service of nature and communities. And but there has to be a huge amount of due diligence done with these companies in the same way that there was with some of the early kind of carbon markets companies, where you got bad actors doing things that gave the whole
Sure.
sector a bad name. The same, I think, would apply to this um, sort of sector as well as it emerges. But for example, I was talking to Planet yesterday, Planet Labs,
Which is
about
a
what they do,
a
and
supplier of
they
satellite imagery.
that's right, exactly. And they were telling me it was astounding what they do really, and they map the full Earth every day. And so they developed this data gathering system that they want to use to help enable anyone interested in measuring kind of climate and
Right.
biodiversity metrics. And they were talking to us about their use of satellite imaging data that produces really high resolution monitoring of the tropical forests that will be critical for this measuring, managing, and reporting basically on the goals of the Paris Agreement. Because at the end of this, we need to be able to report for these countries to then give evidence for the results-based payments that they expect to see, as part of their forest
Yeah.
protection efforts. And there's huge amounts of potential, I think, with this type of
No,
technology.
absolutely. Speaking of another kind of large player in this field, I read in your bio that you worked at BP for 18 years before moving on to this work. So I'm just super curious what was working at BP like, and what is this role like, and what are kind of have been the differences?
Yeah, it's funny actually. After COP, I came back after COP, and I thought, I wonder if I should just write something about life at BP and then
Do a
life
lot of
I've spent
people ask
now.
you?
I left BP 10 years. No, most people are too frightened to ask me, I think.
I have no shame.
I'm very pleased to be asked. So I think, I left about 10 years ago, and I've been kind of in the environmental sector ever since. And of course, they're completely different worlds. And when I started work at BP in 1993, I think it was, climate change was barely a thing, at least not in the mainstream media. And but my journey, I think, is the journey that a lot of people who have worked in
Mm,
energy have come on, where you work on these big energy type issues around, and a lot of what you're working on is access to energy, and kind of how the global economy works. And then I went on a huge learning curve within BP around the environment, and I was actually there during the Lord Brown years where he launched Beyond
right.
Petroleum, talked a lot about climate change, and ended up working in the alternative energy division, actually focused on the technology side of climate change rather than
Right.
the nature side. And there were a group of us there sort of thinking, well, if two-thirds of the problem is energy, a third of the problem is nature, how can we also bring this nature story to the world so that it's not just purely an energy story? It's actually a much more
It
integrated
always
story
is.
than that. And so that's really why I ended up doing that. But in terms of experience, um, you know, not all the people who work in BP are bad people. And I think we used to have a conversation about, sometimes um, good people, bad companies. And I'm sure there are many companies around the world where people are sitting there working away on climate change, thinking, why doesn't the world understand that we should be part of the solution and we
Yeah.
take this seriously? As well. And then you come in on the outside from the activist environmental community, and they're just seen as two
Mm.
completely separate worlds. And I personally think it's actually helpful for people to work in both worlds so that you can get an understanding and develop solutions from across
I
those.
agree. It kind of draws a bit of a parallel with something that I've always been really interested in. Is just for a small side tangent, which is cycling. How to make active transport more of an option in a lot of cities. And I'm Dutch originally, so of course, cycling was second nature. And I was one of three kids that was forced to cycle to my high school in suburban Ontario in Canada by my Dutch parents, which was, not a popular mode of transport in Canada, but, having Dutch parents at home, that was the way you were expected to get to school. And what I always thought was so interesting was, here, of course, in Canada, there's not a lot of cycling infrastructure. So a lot of times either you're on the side of the road or perhaps you're like on the sidewalk if you don't feel safe on the road. And I always thought one of the things when I later moved back to the Netherlands, one of the things that makes cycling culture work is that in the Netherlands and Denmark and perhaps the rest of Scandinavia or Germany, places where there's a lot of cycling, is that cyclists are also car drivers and car drivers are also cyclists. And that's why they have, I want to say, even probably more respect for one another. When I would be, riding my bike around in Toronto, for example, there was always this, us versus them dichotomy that would exist between cyclists and cars. And that's not to say that that's completely gone in a place like Amsterdam, but I think there's a lot more understanding for one another. People know what it's like to be a vulnerable road user on a bike, and
Yeah,
people know what it's like to be driving a car and the damage you could perhaps do it. And people understand each other from both sides. So I think it kind of
yeah.
speaks to a much larger point, as you say, that energy is part of what we need, and companies like BP and Shell and all of these other big actors are part of the solution to help us get there. So I agree, to write them off as bad companies, or even worse, as bad people, is absolutely not the way that to get there. That's ridiculous in my opinion.
Yeah, completely agree. I do think that there is a huge role for keeping the pressure up on these companies, and so that I think a lot of the pressure that has come from organisations like Greenpeace and others plays a
Mm,
very good role in pushing these organizations. But there is also a role for organizations like Nature4Climate and others who continue to work with these big companies to develop solutions on the ground as
absolutely.
well, up to a point. So I think, yeah, I completely agree with you that the you have to work on the inside as well as
Oh,
the outside.
absolutely. It's the only way to get anything done, I would argue.
Yeah, yeah, I
What
agree.
what is your hope for, let's say the next perhaps year to 5 years of the nature tech movement? Where do you want to see it go?
Yeah, I think first of all, just from the nature-based solutions perspective, I'll answer that question. At COP26 in Glasgow, we saw a real moment, I think, where nature went mainstream in inverted
Yeah.
commas, basically, as a climate solution. And that really gave me and many others who've been working on this, people who've been working on it long before I came along, hope that actually finally people are beginning to understand that if you are going to solve the climate change problem, you're going to need to think about how you react with nature as well at the same time. And so there were 141 governments signed up to the Glasgow Leaders Declaration. You saw $20 billion of public and private finance coming into sort of forest protection, forest finance, large companies looking at how they're going to manage their supply chains. So I think there was a real moment for people, not to be complacent, but to just say, okay, that is actually a very big achievement. The big question now is how do you hold those people to account, whether it's governments and companies or individual communities, to say that they're actually going to deliver on what they've said in the next 10 years. And that's where I feel Nature Tech has a role to play. It's not the only answer, but it will have a role to play. And so my hope is to see the world's smartest young people decide that they want to go and work in the nature tech sector or climate tech or whichever sort of variation on tech, to help solve these huge problems, the twin crises really around climate change and biodiversity. And I can see the energy in this sector already. You know, we've just met hundreds of people in the last year who are trying to solve these problems using technology, using science, using innovations. So my hope is that this will really grow and grow. I read a report, I think it was Impact Alpha, have put a report out that in the first half of this year alone, $17 billion was invested into climate tech. And just wouldn't it be fantastic if in a couple of years' time we can look back and say the same kind of factors of money are being invested into nature tech as well?
I want to ask you about something you just touched on, which was that these nature-based solutions, natural climate solutions, have gotten much more mainstream, even at places like COPE, which I think are is a huge step in the right direction. And the reason I think that is because I think where we've gone wrong in recent decades is by having environmentalism, having climate change be framed as a very political issue, an issue that only one side of the aisle, mainly the left, can get on board with, and for everybody else, it's turned into climate change denial. And what I like
Yeah.
about nature-based solutions and ecosystem restoration is that seems like a very bipartisan solution that everybody can get behind. It doesn't seem to carry the same kind of political adversary, or angst even that something like climate change might have. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. And I think that's right. There was some research done by the Nature Conservancy in the US, across the aisle, basically, with Democrats and Republicans. And they found that nature based solutions or natural climate solutions had cross sector appeal, basically, whether you're on the left or right. Very few people think it is a great idea to
Yeah.
cut down a forest or to destroy the environment, really. And so it is therefore a building block that you can use to kind of bring those communities together. It's also a flashpoint in that some people on the left, particularly, feel that actually the right should not be able to come in and have these discussions on nature if they're not also taking similar action on decarbonisation, which is right. And I think you have to I mean, there's no point protecting all the ecosystems on the planet if you continue to emit fossil fuels and don't decarbonize. So the two have to go hand in hand. But it is an area where I think you can get some sort of bipartisan agreement. And also, you've hit like my favorite pet topic was this environmental movement being somewhat kind of
Yeah.
elitist and left leaning. I think that's been one of the biggest problems with the environment movement. I grew up in a very different world from the one I'm currently in now. And, you know, and a lot of my friends still, if you talk to them about the environment, it's a nice to have. They care about jobs and housing and basic things. And I think that's the case as well, certainly in the global south, in the communities we talk to. So you have to make the environment an issue that can create livelihoods at the same time as not destroying the environment.
Yeah, and I think a
Yeah,
lot of that also begins by restoring ecosystems, at people's doorsteps. I think that's an important kind of factor.
yeah,
It's not about climate. It's not about saving the world. It's not about saving the environment. It's about if you live close to a green area, you feel better, you're healthier, you're happier. There are all these other benefits that you can get also in terms of savings for your energy bills. These kind of, it can increase your property values. I think that's kind of where a lot of this discussion will hopefully start in terms of raising awareness locally, indeed, to kind of bring the issue. But I would argue less talk about the issue and perhaps more talk about the solution and all of the benefits it can have right at people's doorsteps to kind of really start raising that awareness.
yeah. I completely agree. I mean, I now live in a small village in Hampshire, and when my husband and I were sort of talking a lot about work, and we decided that it would be good to do something a little
Mm.
bit more local rather than these big kind of global environmental conferences. And so we worked with a local school on a tree planting scheme, which is, it's easy to criticize. It's the easy way in, tree planting. But it is a very good place for people
Yeah.
to start in terms of their understanding of climate change and the environment more broadly. And so for me, I think you're right. It's really important to make sure that people can connect with the issue both globally and internationally, and know that one of the most important things you can do is vote and buy things differently. But it has real local relevance as well, and can be often the most rewarding activity you can do is locally, really, around nature
Yeah,
and
and I'd
environment.
argue too that's probably where a lot of this dichotomy starts to exist is people living in communities where they feel deeply disconnected from nature and being able to just get involved in like local tree
Yeah.
planting campaigns. I mean, I know that's something that sticks out from my own youth, being able to do that at school. It really offers, kids, the especially kids that are growing up in densely populated urban centers, just even the experience of getting their hands in the soil, being active in nature, and therefore growing, understanding it better, and therefore having more empathy for it, and therefore caring about to protect it more. I think that's where it starts.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know from conversations with a lot of my nature
Yeah.
conservancy colleagues, we get together a lot, and they all tell a story about how they connected with nature as a
Mhm.
child, and that's why they do what they do. And I think that's wonderful. And I think if we can have that, that's great. For a lot of people, including myself, I didn't have any connection with nature as a child. It's just I wasn't interested in it. It wasn't near me. I didn't understand it, and so I think what we need to do is be able to take that connection to nature to all the communities, particularly in cities. And I know a lot of your work has been focused on the kind of built environment and urban communities as well. I think that's such an important thing that we need to do, is to try to bring nature and the benefits of nature back into the heart of our cities, which is, after all, where most of the
Yeah,
population
yeah.
live.
Speaking of direct impact, absolutely. That's where to get them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lucy, this has been lovely. Where can people find you and Nature for Climate, or more about the Nature Tech movement online if they're interested?
Yeah, so there's a Nature for Climate website, which is just www.nature4, the number 4, climate.org, and a lot of the work on nature-based solutions is there. And then we've also launched a new NatureTech group on LinkedIn. So if you type in NatureTech Nexus on LinkedIn, you can find us there. And actually, we've launched a new startup of our own called the NatureTech Nexus, which is a group now based out in California who are looking at how we can bring this
Wow.
community together and help create events on this topic. So the NatureTech Nexus launched at COP and now has a website as well. Fingers
Wow,
crossed, it's up and
congratulations.
running.
That's super exciting.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay, Lucy, and then the last question that I ask all of my guests who come on the show is, what does the Internet of Nature mean to you?
So the Internet of Nature is interesting because I'm not a techie person at all, but I think this connectivity that nature does naturally, if we could combine the kind of the best of the internet to connect people and ideas with this natural ability that happens, then I think that's where you've got a kind of real sweet spot in your work, Nadina, that you do. So I'm really hopeful that this sort of connection bridge between nature and technology is something that we can help, sort of make real in the next few
Well, I think
years.
that's a beautiful place to end it. Thanks for coming on, Lucy.
Thank you very much. Delighted.
Thanks to Lucy for coming on the show. If you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast now and leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast. We really appreciate it, and it really helps to grow the show. We'll be back next week with René Vogt of Connected Green, a system of wireless sensors which are invisibly placed to monitor urban green spaces. In the meantime, I encourage you to check out Nature4Climate, that's 4 as in the number, to find out how governments, business, and communities and nature are all coming together to mitigate 10 gigatons of CO2 by 2030. Lastly, a big thank you to this show's sponsor, the International Society of Arboriculture. If you want to learn more about some of the most topical issues in the arboricultural industry and network with industry experts and peers, we invite you to attend the ISA 2022 International Conference in Malmö, Sweden from the 12th to the 14th of September. More information and how to register can be found at www.isa-arbor.com. Thank you for listening to the Internet of Nature podcast. The show is an NA Media production.